Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to this talk on the findings from the TANC Provisional Semantics project. I'm Victoria Parkinson. I'm the chair of the ARLIS Cataloguing and Classification Committee. The Art Library Society UK and Ireland has art libraries, librarians and other interested groups and individuals coming together to support and enrich the profession. And if you're interested in supporting our work, you can find out how to join and become a member at arlis.net. Today's event is organised by the ARLIS Cat and Class Committee as part of a series of talks we've been hosting on cataloguing and classification ethics. We have one more coming up next week, and the details of that I'll pop at the end of the chat, end of the talk in the chat. But huge thanks to the other members of the committee for organising these talks. At the end of the presentation, there will be time for questions. So if you put them in the Q&A box or in the chat as you think of them, then at the end, I'll read them out for Ananda to answer. But let's get going. I'll hand over to my fellow committee member, Katie, to introduce our speaker today.
Hi, good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for attending. My name is Katie Blackford. I'm a liaison librarian at Tate and secretary of the ARLIS Cataloguing and Classification Committee. I'm pleased to introduce Ananda Rutherford. Ananda is a researcher and former collections manager who's previously worked at a number of museums, including the Museum of the Home, the Crafts Council and the V&A. Ananda was research associate on the Provisional Semantics project, which will be the focus of today's talk, and she is currently a research fellow at the University of the Arts London with the Decolonising Arts Institute on a project titled Transforming Collections, Reimagining Art, Nation and Heritage. And I will now hand over to Ananda.
Hi, thanks Katie, thanks Victoria. I'm going to try and share my screen semi-competently. If you can just say yay, you can see it. Yes, great. Okay. So as Katie said, I'm Ananda Rutherford and I was the research associate on the AHRC towards the National Collection Foundation project, Provisional Semantics, addressing the challenges of representing multiple perspectives within an evolving digitised national collection. I'm going to try and describe the project, what we were aiming to achieve, or what we thought we were aiming to achieve, and what we actually did, before I explain some of our findings. The final report for the project is due out sort of now, shortly, imminently, but there's a lot of ground to cover. It's actually quite long. So as the title suggests, I'm going to focus on two areas that came up repeatedly over the 2 years of the project, and they are project working itself and also incorporating positionality into our work. And that means your work as well as our work in research, as in these projects in cultural heritage or the GLAM sector. I hope that I can weave these ideas round to address what approaches could and should be employed to engage critically and ethically with documentation, cataloguing and interpretation. Just to note, as Katie said, my experience is in museum cataloguing. And I know this audience will be largely made up of archivists and librarians. Our different disciplines are often and oddly siloed, yet we use the same words to mean entirely different things. But I hope the ideas and issues I describe will be horribly familiar. And I hope the principles of how we practice ethically, reflectively and thoughtfully will resonate with you, whichever type of organisation you work in. In the broadest terms, I'm talking about how we think, describe and write about stuff in galleries, libraries, archives and museums. So just a little context about the setup for this and for the project. Provisional Semantics was part of the Towards National Collection, or TANC, funding initiative from the Arts and Humanities Research Council in the UK. I'm guessing most people in the UK in the sector will have heard of TANC by now, but in case you don't know, according to their website, TANC is supporting research that breaks down the barriers that exist between the UK's outstanding cultural heritage collections with the aim of opening them up to new research opportunities and encouraging the public to explore them in new ways. The TANC research projects are intended to explore the creation of a unified virtual national collection, which undeniably, though not usually clearly acknowledged, actually rests on the work we do, records, catalogues and documentation in all their various, incomplete, impenetrable, inconsistently digitised and often unthinkingly colonial forms. In the funding proposal, the intention for the Provisional Semantics project was described thus: Provisional semantics is an interrogation of how long-standing, problematic or racist hierarchies, binaries, narratives and perspectives are produced and reinforced in catalogue entries, object descriptions, and interpretive material. The original aim was to address a fundamental challenge facing the TANC, or Towards a National Collection programme, which is, and still is, how to develop ethical, equitable and transparent readings of the objects in a digitised national collection. Our objectives then were to identify the scale of the challenge in terms of the values, processes, practices and resources needed, to pilot methodologies through 3 case studies that engage with the decolonisation agenda, and I put decolonisation always in slightly tentative speech marks, to enable staff to work with colleagues internally and with key stakeholders to describe and interpret collections and catalogues. And thirdly, to review with experts the efficacy of the 3 case study interventions within the broader context of the sector's need to revise approaches to cataloguing and interpreting the objects and artefacts they hold. So our methodology was threefold. Firstly, practice-based action research, which was appropriate, reflecting on the work we do as practitioners. All of the co-investigators are curatorial and learning practitioners, as were of course the library team at Tate, and I myself am a former collections manager and curator. We also have a literature and practice review, which I've got to sheepishly say I'm still working on, but there has been significant growth since 2019 in new work in both the areas of museum so-called decolonisation and equitable cataloguing practices where there wasn't before. So I've had to add another section on to actually deal with the sort of snowballing effect of 2020 and 21 when engagement in heritage practices came to the fore. And thirdly, 3 case studies. I can show you these. We carried out 3 case studies with the 3 partner institutions on the project, Imperial War Museums, Tate and the National Trust. These involved close readings of artefacts, their associated information, interpretation, presentation, and I'm going to talk a little bit about each of them now and their specific characteristics and what we did and what happens. So for the first case study with the IWM, we focused on a sample of 53 black and white photographs and their original captions from a series of British official photographs, a series taken in India in 1942, covering the recruitment of Indian soldiers during the Second World War. The purpose was to investigate whether the addition of contextual information and descriptions from perspectives outside of IWM could mitigate the problematic framing of the colonial gaze present in the images and the archaic, sometimes offensive language of the historic captions. The work provided insights into institutional cataloguing, the institutional cataloguing processes and systems, and the value of close readings of collections objects. Attempting to recaption or redescribe the images surfaced the degree of scrutiny and care required to undertake this work, and the dangers of inadvertently or uncritically reproducing colonial and imperial perspectives. The IWM case study revealed that inaccuracies, bias, politicised language, historical or otherwise, politicised language, historical or otherwise, in how images are described may only be obvious to the people they describe or the nations they characterise. Well, we can't be expert in everything. Careful, sensitive checking of the terms commonly used is important. Seemingly innocuous phrases, such as the Punjab being labelled as the breadbasket of India, may be more problematic when we stop to think who the land and resources of that breadbasket actually belonged to and who was exploiting them. Or apparently, another example, apparently complementary descriptions, so referring to Sikhs as a warrior race, who were actually based in eugenicist ideas of martial race theory. However, at the same time, the process of rewriting showed that removing problematic words or phrases does not equate to removing the problematic histories that inform the production, presentation, and purpose of the material we were dealing with. The images could be described in more accurate, inclusive, and appropriate terms, but the British imperial propagandist agenda remains inherent in the pictures themselves. Thus, contextualising the image content is crucial, and attempts at any kind of objective or neutral content description are to deny the political, personal, and social context of the images as well as to obfuscate the experiences of those people whose bodies, whose bodily autonomy and personal experience are captured in the pictures and subsequently instrumentalized to illustrate a colonial narrative and then represent work in a 21st century museum. The last finding is perhaps a glaringly obvious one, but it's true across all the case studies. That is, evidence of the invaluable contribution that external voices can make to institutionally led projects grappling with collections formed during empire and informed by colonialist perspectives. The second case study centred on the so-called Clive Museum collection of objects from across Asia, which is held at Powys Castle in Wales, where the history, agency and beauty of the artefacts is often overshadowed by the problematic colonial activities of Robert Clive, also known as Clive of India. This case study took place alongside the debate and media controversy around the National Trust in 2020 and 2021 and ongoing. The case study centred on, again, on close reading of texts related to artefacts on display in the museum. This was accomplished through 3 collaborative online workshops. You have to remember we were working through COVID, and we took a particular choice not to involve or try to involve what's often termed community work, because we didn't feel that we could support people through the work, which can be quite problematic, and that contact with the objects was going to be very problematic and difficult to achieve. So those 2 things meant we had to do this all online. So we had these 3 collaborative online workshops with key stakeholders, including history and language experts, staff across the National Trust, and staff and volunteers working at Powys Castle. There was specific focus on an early 19th century illuminated bound volume of the poems of Hafez, the great Persian thinker and poet. You can see that in the image there, displayed in a rather dismal case in the museum space. The workshop sessions were brilliantly designed by my colleague, Dr. Anjali Dalal-Clayton, to be both a virtual walkthrough to understand the display, location and experience of encountering the objects, as well as detailed scrutiny of catalogue entries, information boards, case labels, and any other online or offline pertinent interpretive materials. Issues and ideas raised by the groups address language and translation, label accessibility, display, provenance, family myths, iconography and institutional hearsay, as well as political opinion and practical concerns. These sessions were rich, thought-provoking and eye-opening. The process of what was intended to be a response and observation ended up much closer to a form of collaborative cataloguing and knowledge sharing, and was incredibly valuable. The discussion and close readings provided useful insights into how institutional and object histories and descriptions determine the nature of collection interpretation. The research also surfaced again the necessity of working with those with specialist knowledge and lived experience. So perhaps most pertinent to this group is the 3rd case study, which was the Panchayat Archive or Special Collection in Tate Library. The Tate case study focused on the Panchayat collection, and its primary focus was the re-inclusion of key stakeholders to tell the story of the collection and recenter the artists that it represents. However, in attempting this seemingly straightforward ambition, issues were raised relating to the ethical and practical dimensions of the research project structure and understanding the complexity of attempting to incorporate a genuinely multi-perspectival and open approach to institutional collection practices. The Panchayat collection contains documents, ephemera, manuscripts, images, various publications and research material illustrating an important link between modern art and activism. Founded in 1988 by Bhajan Hunjan, Shaheen Murali, Simrat Patti, Alan D'Souza and Shanti Thomas to promote the work of South Asian artists and artists with Black, Caribbean and African heritage in the UK and internationally. It has been with the Tate since 2015, but was neither fully catalogued nor digitised. And this case study aimed to place the artists and originators at the collection at the heart of its history, foregrounding their voices. Tangentially, it also engaged with the current limitations of library practice and cataloguing standards, especially in relation to material categorised as ephemera, or not even as formally as ephemera, but as ephemeral almost. Things that don't fit traditional systems of cultural value writ large in the hierarchies and disciplines of information management. At the Tate and other institutions, it's not explicitly stated, but essentially the art collections are more important than the archives, which are more important than the library. And I know none of us believe that, but it is often how it works in terms of money and engagement. And this plays out in how the collections are treated. This issue of items not fitting was evident across all three case studies. But when the only historical representation is an as yet unidentified photograph or a photocopied flyer, we need to take care in ensuring that we approach it without the hierarchies and socio-economic values of the global art market, or a 19th century idea of the historic art academy tradition. One of the clearest findings was the degree, in this case study specifically, was the degree of reparative sensitivity required by institutions working with artists and other stakeholders, represented by and associated with collections in their care, especially in cases where collections, works, and individuals have been historically marginalised. With living artists, you are dealing with their lives and also their disappointing experiences with the art world, and specifically the institutions that were meant to champion them, but have neglected, rejected, or periodically instrumentalised them and their work. Additionally, we need to be aware, and this was clear in this case study, that our practices of knowledge capture and dissemination, claiming, owning, and recording are run through with appropriation and control. That said, the generosity of the artists and thinkers involved with the Panchat research was astounding, and I was really privileged to be able to witness some of the conversations, and those are recorded and will be up on the Tate website this summer, I hope. So you'll be able to watch what they have to say about their history, their dealings with the collection, what's in it, their ideas at the time. They're really rich conversations between some great people. We saw how project requirements for co-production, testimony, and formal archive practices carried out in an institutional context can be extractive, however well-intentioned they are. Further, while research is recognised as a valuable and validating process for the institution's academic status and contribution to a notional art historical or cultural record, the cost benefit to those who are repeatedly positioned outside or adjacent to the institution as both subject and object in the research process is frequently overlooked and misunderstood. Again, the case study revealed the importance of recognising and honouring complexity in multi-perspectival representations. The case study surfaced how genuine co-production requires institutions to step back, relinquish control, and fully embrace equitable working practices. So how do these findings and observations relate to projects and positionality? I've already alluded to the limitations of project working a bit in some of the case studies, but perhaps I can make it more explicit in our overarching findings for the entire project. So basically, projects are not, short-term projects especially, are just not a sustainable way to bring about change. It's almost impossible to address the structural issues in the way that heritage and academia are organised, which they don't serve racialised and minoritised people well. So here are some of our observations about what might be done better. So I've got a list. So I've got 4 here. Research projects should be devised and delivered by a team that has appropriate specialist expertise and lived experience. It seems obvious, but this wasn't the case on this project, and it's not often the case on projects. We were a majority white project addressing issues that almost exclusively affected particular groups of people of colour and Black people. And to be doing that work is not great, and it keeps happening, and it's very difficult to know how to unpick it, but we've thought hard about this, and I think these principles are well known, but they're still not actually applied. We had to acknowledge this, which we did in our interim report, but redressing the balance after the fact is problematic and risks being tokenistic and an afterthought. So we think it's crucial to build in time and resources to develop networks and relationships of trust with the appropriate prospective researchers and participants. And this needs to happen during bid development, not after. And at the other end of the project, the other end of the project Gantt chart, as it were, it's crucial as well to look at project legacies, how people and relationships will be supported by the institution after the project end, how material will be accessed and used, and how that access will be managed and maintained. Another point is project budgets, timescales, and the use of institutional contracts, which can impact negatively on the formation of ethical and equitable partnerships with collaborators. There is always a power dynamic. This is particularly important in relation to IPR and contractual commitments and appropriate recompense. We need to recognise that not everyone has the energy, availability, time and inclination to work to your research agenda in your project timescale. Understanding this and being flexible about expectations and outputs accordingly is more, I think, respectful than claiming that it's all too difficult and simply excluding those who won't or can't fit with your agenda. Or the other way is prioritising an essentially extractive research agenda over people's sensibilities and requirements. Institutions basically need to commit resources, time and energy to cataloguing collections and involving people properly. In doing the case study research, it was evident that many of the issues we were looking at were simply down to a lack of cataloguing and information. So what's to be done then when the basics of what a work or artifact actually is and what it represents is either entirely missing, inaccurate, or hopelessly out of date? The item effectively disappears, and this was rather the case with the Panchayat. But the team, Jane Bramwell and Katie Blackford, took on this challenge and set out to match the ambition of what was needed to establish and amplify the collection within the Tate and more widely. And they have a programme of ongoing cataloguing and digitisation, co-working and an actual budget in the ongoing selection of materials, dealing with IPR and engagement with key stakeholders that continues way beyond the duration of the project. And with the IWM records, the original captions, the working methods, the revised contextual descriptions are now available in their CMS internally and externally in their online collections, alongside a sort of mini website with contextual essays by researchers, glossaries of key terms and ideas that needed explanation, and a bit about the project, so what we did and why. Projects that do this core work of cataloguing now seem to me to be relatively rare, and resources, commitment to and recognition of cataloguing work as an essential tool for visibility, representation, amplification doesn't really seem to fly with funders and senior management. It was written into elements of our project, but it's very often a bolt-on. And I'm watching projects fail because that information hasn't actually been, that knowledge production hasn't been done well or collaboratively. And we're still at a very sort of basic stage often. And as we all know, with huge backlogs to deal with. So I don't have a neat link here, but I'm going to go on and talk about positionality, which I hope you might have seen is coming through with some of the ideas here, which is about self-reflection and understanding your own position and role in project research, your job, the institution. So projects are a problem, but so is positionality, or the lack of it. I've got a couple of definitions up here. I'm just checking the time if I'm okay. Saying that positionality is the notion that personal values, views, and location in time and space influence how one understands the world. In this context, gender, race, class, and other aspects of identities are indicators of social and spatial positions and are not fixed given qualities. And that's from the Sage Encyclopedia of Geography. There's apparently a Sage dictionary or encyclopedia for most things, which I was unaware of, but anyway. The second definition is further back, but 2004, in relating to the Sage Dictionary of Cultural Studies, and it says knowledge is not to be understood as a neutral or objective, sorry, that's a typo, I think, or objective phenomenon, but as a social and cultural production, since the position from which knowledge is enunciated will shape the very character of that knowledge. And that's something I think we need to hold on to in the cataloguing work that we do. So positionality work was crucial to the provisional semantics team at several levels, to the team to try and truly understand their own rules and understandings of racism, especially in a majority white team, in majority white institutions, in a majority white sector. It is in no way a panacea, and certainly we wouldn't claim it doesn't prevent people from behaving in harmful ways. But personally, when we realised the makeup of the team was really not appropriate, I'm not sure I could have continued without scrutinising ideas of white advantage and structural racism. And in the interest of promoting personal positionality, and I should probably say this in the beginning, but I'm trying in my professional research practice to acknowledge this, but I will briefly state my own position. I'm of mixed heritage, but entirely acculturated by upbringing, education and experience as white and English and horribly middle class. I have experienced both overt and covert racism, but professionally, I feel conscious of not foregrounding my experiences for validation or justification. So that's where I am at the moment, and it does change. So here is some of the work, and I think the question is, what does positionality work actually look like? So again, these are some of the things that as a team we thought were important. Again, building in sufficient time and discussion into project planning to guarantee that prospective team members have a common understanding of the issues that the project itself addresses and how stakeholders may be impacted. In projects such as provisional semantics that address the marginalisation and misrepresentation of Black people and people of colour, research teams should commit to active anti-racism, undertaking the necessary reading, reflection and positionality work to the project, commencing to the project. And again, commencing with a recognition that positionality work does not mitigate against all personal and systematic racist behaviours. There also need to be mechanisms in place to identify when reversions to problematic behaviours are happening and to deal with them. Such mechanisms, based on the principle of democratic scrutiny, could include building in collective criticality and reflective questioning. For example, one of the things I currently do is try to ask, who is this for? Who is this work for? Who does it cause offence to? And does it involve equitable exchange? But I have much longer questions, many questions to try and put checks and balances on my learnt professional behaviours. And also obtaining consensus from a fully representative research team on decisions to be taken throughout the project. We also think that you need to be alert to the value of continual consultation and sense checking within the project team and with external stakeholders to avoid reverting to or being overwhelmed by institutional orthodoxies, attitudes and processes which are often unquestioningly systematically colonial and often racist. From the instigation of a project, the research team should adopt an approach based on humility, openness, and willingness to learn and change. So, in summary, positionality requires constant critical engagement with and reflection on the research of the positionality through a project, and I've said life, really. So, trying to make this really specific, some of you may have seen this one from me before, but I wanted to think about, in more practical terms, how does this work manifest in the work we do, managing, producing information and interpretation? So my question is, what approaches can be employed to engage critically and ethically to tackle structural bias and the hegemony of traditional Western colonial norms of knowledge production and practice? And for the project, I identified 5 areas that I think need to be fully considered in rethinking cataloguing, classification and interpretation. Firstly, language, the words we use and how we write, how we deal with harm and offence without denying the historical or even contemporary use of racist words. Language addresses more than offensive words. It is the tone, professionalism, descriptive neutrality, authority and translation, which all come into play to construct the objective, so-called authoritative museum voice. There's subject and content, which is asking, what and who do we choose to write about? Which artists are privileged? Which topics and themes, which material are privileged in terms of publication, expertise and resources, and used as representative of the collection? And I think we all know this in our collections. The star objects, what they are and who they're by, are easy to identify, but rarely representative in terms of all kinds of identities, including gender and disability, and of course, race and ethnicity. Thirdly, there's knowledge creation, and I have more questions here. Who is involved when we do this? Who's listened to? Who can get access to their own information, objects and archives? And who is allowed to use the material and how? Who participates in knowledge generation? And then there's the tools we use, catalogue, practice and systems, how we organise information, how we organise and structure data, what we choose to privilege in analogue and digital systems, data structures, publication and editing practices. And most importantly, can we be transparent and clear about who is doing what and why? So I'm a strong advocate of authoring all writing, saying who it's come from, so that it's not from an anonymous authoritative museum or library voice, which is nebulous and yet strangely controlling. And lastly, context and history. How did we get here? Why does it work this way? Institutional biographies, institutional infrastructure, social and political agendas, hierarchies of value, worth and deficit thinking, personal positions that we inevitably work within, these all need critical evaluation and honesty. So lastly, in summary, I don't know whether this is provisional semantics with a small s. The semantics are, in conclusion, always provisional, shifting and never neutral, and we need to deal with that better. And context is all. Who, where, why, what and when all alter the meaning, use, sense and implications of what we write and how we write it, and we need to be honest about that. Thank you. And my last slide is just people on the team and a couple of links there. So I can leave that up or stop sharing.